Vampires, bloodsuckers, the undead, creatures of the night, Nosferatu. We've all heard of vampires in one way or another, but how well do we really know them? This Lore Dump episode is going to unearth the history of vampires and trace how this supernatural creature entered the bloodstream of Gothic literature. There are, of course, many different facets of the vampire, and so this episode will be focusing on the vampire's folkloric origins in Eastern Europe, the use and prevalence of vampirism as an economic metaphor, and then briefly discussing two key texts that popularised the traditional male vampire. But if you want us to delve into other versions of the vampire in future episodes, such as the female vampire, other cultural traditions of the vampire, vampires on film and TV, or even vampire boyfriends, then let us know in the comments. For now, though, let's begin by sinking our teeth into those Eastern European myths. In the year 1731, and on the order of the Austrian Emperor, Regimental Field Surgeon Johannes Flukinger, along with several other officers in the Austrian army, arrived in a village in Serbia to investigate a suspected case of vampirism. The origin of this epidemic had been traced back to a man named Arnold Paul, a hejduke, which is a type of soldier, who had died 5 years prior to the investigation. Recently, however, 17 people had died in close succession, and not only were fingers pointed back at Arnold Paul, but these deaths were alleged to be vampire attacks. Flukinger's report, which was signed by officers in the Austrian army, as well as 3 doctors, appeared the following year in 1732. It recounts the original story of Arnold Paul as told to the investigators by the local villagers, and it then details what Flukinger's investigation unearthed. Arnold Paul, it is reported, had died of a broken neck following a hay wagon accident, but during his life, he was rumoured to have been troubled by a vampire. Flukinger writes that he had eaten from the earth of the vampire's grave and had smeared himself with the vampire's blood in order to be free from the vexation he had suffered. But his attempts to stop the spread of vampirism to himself were, it would seem, unsuccessful. After his death, many people complained that Arnold Paul was visiting them, and he allegedly killed 4 people in his nightly visits. And so, the village did what anyone would do when you suspect an undead individual of nocturnal vampiric attacks. They dug him up. What they found was a fresh, undecayed corpse, or at least that's what they believed. The report notes that fresh blood had flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, that the shirt, the covering, and the coffin were completely bloody, that the old nails on his hands and feet, along with the skin, had fallen off, and that new ones had grown. Thus, convinced that he was, irrefutably, a true vampire, the villagers drove a stake through his heart, as was their local custom, and the body emitted an audible groan and started to bleed. What we know now is that such descriptions are characteristic of the natural decomposition of corpses. Hair, teeth, and fingernails might appear to grow as the skin on dead bodies starts to shrink. Similarly, as internal organs start to break down and decompose, a dark liquid can leak out from the nose and mouth and create the appearance of blood. And the groan, exhaled by corpses upon being staked, can be explained as the release of gases trapped in dead bodies. Such medical and scientific observations, however, are recent, and in the 18th century, folkloric beliefs concluding such features to be evidence of vampirism prevailed. Arnold Paul's body was burned, while those deemed to be his victims, and thus now turned vampire themselves, were also disinterred and examined, their heads cut off, their bodies burnt, and the ashes thrown in the river Morava. The case of Arnold Paul is just one of many cases of vampirism that broke out across Eastern Europe, contributing to what is now known as the vampire craze. And there are 2 particularly interesting aspects to the case of Arnold Paul. Firstly, the involvement of the Austrian authority, and secondly, how quickly the report spread across Europe. Endorsed by government and medical authorities in Austria, Fluckinger's report created a semblance of credibility and appeared to provide proof of the existence of vampires. Moreover, and echoing the outbreak of vampirism in Eastern Europe, Fluckinger's report sparked an epidemic of publications across Europe, as this report, and translations of it, appeared in Vienna, Nuremberg, Leipzig, Berlin, Paris, and London. Nick Groom also notes that in the 3 years following its initial publication, 12 books and 4 dissertations on vampirism appeared. Not everyone was convinced, however. French Benedictine monk Don Augustin Calmet was one of several religious figures in the 18th century who investigated this phenomena in the wake of the vampire craze. Calmet's research eventually became part of his published work, Dissertation upon the Apparition of Angels, Demons, and Ghosts, first published in 1764. And yet while such religious work remains sceptical of the legitimacy of supernatural vampires and other monsters, the fact that vampires were being considered at all by religious officials conferred recognition and legitimacy upon them, albeit probably unintentionally. There was, it seemed, no way to stop the spread of vampires, or to stop people talking about them. The vampires of folklore are not pretty. They don't smell great, and they certainly don't sparkle. Typifying a recently buried and decomposing corpse, vampires of folklore are also representative of the villages that they emerge from, in that they are poor and not aristocratic, wealthy castle dwellers. Associations with wealth and social elites is something that emerges from Gothic texts, such as John Polidori's The Vampyre and Bram Stoker's Dracula, novels that we will explore in the final section of this lore dump. But before we turn to these literary works, I want to quickly discuss how the vampire was transformed from a folkloric figure into a synonym for financial exploitation, or rather, a foreign monster that is quite literally bleeding Britain dry. As the vampires of Eastern European folklore entered the bloodstream of Western Europe, and as these stories were discussed, debated, and disseminated further, by the end of the 18th century, everyone, from writers to politicians and even to kings and lords, had become enthralled by them. The Earl of Sandwich famously chose vampire as the name for his racehorse in the 1750s, while Horace Walpole, the author who birthed the Gothic genre with his 1764 novel The Castle of Otranto, wrote that the late King of Britain was a believer in the, quote, existence of vampires and their banquets of the dead, end quote. Yet it is in the political sphere that metaphorical vampirism, that is, the use of this figure to critique economic and financial monsters existing in the real world, that the connection between vampires, wealth, and foreign monstrosity became cemented. One of the most enduring criticisms of Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto Prime Minister and also Horace Walpole's dad, was levied at him by Charles Forman, a political pamphleteer who framed war, foreign trade deals, and taxes as potentially depleting the blood and money of Britain. Turning to vampirism, Forman lamented that vampiric merchants were rifling and wounding Britain in order to send money to foreign countries, and he further argued that taxation was simply a way to, quote, indulge the luxury and gratify the rapine of a fat-gutted vampire, end quote. Similarly, in his philosophical dictionary, Voltaire included an entry on vampires that denied the existence of supernatural vampires by admitting that they already existed in real life. In Paris and in London, he writes, were stock jobbers, brokers, and men of business who sucked the blood of the people in broad daylight, but they were not dead, though corrupted. Connected to financial capitals and highlighting merchants with global connections, such metaphorical vampires echo those of Eastern European folklore in that the vampires in question are distinctly not British. And here I also want to note that this connection with financial foreign monsters aligns with British anxieties of Jewish others, traditions of anti-Semitism, and xenophobia more broadly. By the 19th century, then, vampires, whether that be the putrid and evil vampires of folklore, or metaphorical vampires sucking blood and money from societies, were fairly well known. There were some notable poems delving into supernatural vampires, such as John Stagg's The Vampire from 1810, but there was no established vampire tradition in Gothic literature. That is, until John Polidori's short story, The Vampyre, published in 1819. Polidori's vampire tale is said to be the story that sparked the genre of romantic vampire fiction, and it remains incredibly influential to the creation of the male vampire tradition through its aristocratic, Byronic vampire. Polidori was, in fact, Byron's physician, travelling with him across Europe and visiting Percy and Mary Shelley at the Villa Diodati in 1816, where they contributed to the now infamous Night of Ghost Stories. Byron's contribution was a fragment about a vampire, and Polidori very liberally took this fragment as inspiration for his own later story, drawing on the celebrity of Byron while also not so subtly recasting Byron as his vampire, Lord Ruthven. The name Ruthven was actually taken from Lady Caroline Lamb's novel Glenarvan, in which she created a very unflattering parody of Byron. Polidori's vampire is, like Byron, a social elite, an unapologetic womanizer, and the similarities led many people to initially believe Byron himself to be the author. Polidori quickly set the record straight that, though the groundwork is certainly Lord Byron's, its development is mine, and the rest, as they say, is history, with the creation of an aristocratic, sexy and Byronic vampire archetype. Much of the vampire takes place in Greece, and while this is not exactly the vampire of Eastern European folklore, it is clear that the vampiric monstrosity of Lord Ruthven is characterised as foreign and non-British. As Christopher Frayling highlights, Polidori's story manages to weave together many of the disparate threads of the vampire into a coherent literary genre, while also leaving his mark with his Byronic vampire. Today, Bram Stoker's Dracula is probably the most well-known vampire text. By the time of its publication in 1897, there was an established literary tradition, beginning with Polidori's tale, and also including stories by Sheridan Le Fanu, James Malcolm Ryder, and Thomas Peckett Prest, as well as many, many others. Stoker's novel builds on this tradition, but he also returns to some of the previous vampires of history. Notably, he spent several years researching the vampires of Eastern European folklore. Dracula is a foreign Eastern European count from Transylvania who threatens the women and the body politic of Britain. Like the vampires of Eastern European folklore, Dracula emits a putrid smell of death and decay, and in his vampiric slumber, he looks like an undead corpse. But, like Lord Ruthven, he is at times also a sexy aristocrat, or perhaps rather a seductive and enthralling aristocrat who lures both men and women into his vampiric embrace. And emphasizing the economic threat he poses and the connection between blood and capital, Dracula even symbolically bleeds money while he nourishes himself with the blood of British women. As I said at the beginning of this episode, there are many different types of vampire, and the male vampire, emerging in British Gothic literature in the 19th century and drawing on Eastern European folklore, popular culture, and pervasive economic metaphors, is just one of them. If you would like to see more lore dumps on vampires, or if there are any other monsters or topics you want to see us discuss, then do let us know in the comments or message us at the Ghoul Guides. And until next time, stay safe and stay spooky.